Forget the sanitized portraits in museum halls. Forget the polite timelines in school books, where kings and queens pass the crown as if it were a family heirloom in an orderly line. Forget the easy stories that say it was simply Lancaster versus York, red versus white, a squabble of roses. Because what if it was something else entirely? What if this wasn't just a dynastic quarrel, but the slow unmaking of a kingdom? What if behind the heraldry and pageantry lay a story of whispers in candle-lit corridors, daggers unsheathed under velvet cloaks, and battlefields where the mud drank more blood than rain? What if the Wars of the Roses weren't just a civil war, but a reckoning with the very idea of kingship? This is not just history. This is the anatomy of ambition. Across 6 acts, we will walk from the hushed chambers of Westminster to the roar of Towton, the bloodiest day ever fought on English soil. We will stand in the shadow of cathedrals where oaths were sworn and broken. We will ride with kings into battle, watch them flee in disgrace and see them return, or not at all. We will meet not just monarchs, but the women who moved them like pieces on a board. Not just armies, but the quiet hands that stitched banners for them. Not just victories, but the betrayals that erased them overnight. This is not the story of one crown. It is the story of how England nearly tore itself apart to decide who could wear it. And by the end, you will not only know who won, you will understand why the peace that followed was built on the memory of bones. So go back. Back before Bosworth, before Tewkesbury, before St. Albans. Back to a kingdom that looked strong from a distance, but was already cracking at its foundations. Back to a boy king named Henry VI, gentle in soul, disastrous in rule. Back to a queen, Margaret of Anjou, whose courage was a weapon and whose enemies called her the she-wolf. Back to a time when a single misstep in council could spark a battle, and a single battle could change the course of a century. The Wars of the Roses did not erupt in a day. They were seeded in grudges, watered with suspicion, and fed by a crown too heavy for one man to bear. This was not just a war of swords, but of wills, a long storm rolling over the realm, tearing down kings and raising new ones in its wake. It began not with roses, but with thorns. And once they pierced the heart of England, there was no pulling them out without blood. Opening cinematic London, late winter, 1455. The sun, pale as a coin worn smooth by too many hands, hung low above the city. A damp mist clung to the narrow lanes, curling around the timbers of leaning houses and blurring the edges of banners that hung limply in the cold air. Merchants shouted half-heartedly from their stalls, their voices muffled as if the fog itself wished to keep secrets. The River Thames rolled past in slow, glassy ripples, carrying the smells of hearth smoke and tar out toward the sea. From the wharves to the shadow of St. Paul's, people moved in cautious clusters. They spoke in low tones, not because they feared to be overheard, but because the entire realm seemed to be holding its breath. Rumors moved faster than carts. The king's strange illness had returned. The queen's household was raising men-at-arms. The Duke of York had summoned his banners. In the heart of the city, the bells of Westminster tolled, their deep iron voices rolling over rooftops. Behind the palace walls, England's crown rested on the head of a man who could not hold it steady, a king whose moments of clarity were as brief and fragile as the winter sun. Yet beyond those walls, in the shires and borderlands, lords were calling their retainers, sharpening swords that had not seen war since France. The omniscient eye moves northward, over frost-hardened fields where mounted messengers gallop between stone keeps, bearing letters sealed in wax and urgency. It glides across the Pennine Hills where smoke from manor chimneys rises into a pale sky, and over the fortified gates of York, where a tall figure studies a map by candlelight. Richard, Duke of York, his bloodline as royal as the king's, listens to the wind rattling the shutters. In its hollow murmur, he hears both warning and invitation. To the west, in a drafty hall lit by rush torches, Margaret of Anjou walks between rows of armored men, her gown trailing like a crimson banner. She does not smile. She does not need to. Her presence alone steels them for what is to come. The Queen has no intention of yielding to any man's claim but her husband's, and through him, her son's. England is not yet at war. No formal challenge has been issued. No armies have yet clashed. But in the hush before the storm, something electric threads through the air, an anticipation that stirs the blood and quickens the heartbeat. Before the first sword is drawn, the realm already knows. The coming struggle will decide more than who wears the crown. It will decide whether England can survive its own ambitions. And so, while London held its breath beneath a veil of mist, the heart of that tension beat not in the streets but within the palace itself, where the man at its center, England's king, sat beneath the gaze of his ancestors, and seemed as fragile as the peace he presided over. The image of Henry VI. Within the palace, the air smelled faintly of beeswax and old parchment. Tapestries hung heavy on the walls, their threads depicting past kings in scenes of triumph. Henry V astride his charger at Agincourt, banners snapping in the wind. The fields of France bowed beneath English steel. The man who now wore that crown sat beneath those woven glories, yet seemed smaller than the chair in which he rested. Henry VI's hands were long and fine-boned, more suited to turning pages than wielding a sword. This morning, as on so many mornings, he was bent over a gilded book of hours, his lips moving soundlessly in prayer. The light from a high, narrow window caught the edge of his cheek, pale as carved alabaster, and turned the thin gold circlet of his crown into a halo. To a casual eye, he might have seemed a saint in the making. But saints, for all their virtue, do not often hold kingdoms together. Around him, counselors waited in measured silence. Some exchanged glances, not out of impatience, but out of the quiet dread that comes when a kingdom's fate hangs on a man lost in his own devotions. For Henry's mind could drift, not in the way of dreamers, but as if some great tide pulled him away from the shore of the present. On those days, governance slipped from his grasp entirely. When word came of Normandy's loss, when the ports that had flown the cross of St. George for a century fell one by one to the French, Henry had not raged, nor commanded a counterattack. Instead, he had retreated to his chapel, his voice soft but unyielding in prayer for peace. There was a purity in it, the kind that might inspire a parish priest, but it chilled the hearts of men who understood that crowns are not kept by prayers alone. In the city, common folk still spoke of him with affection, remembering his charity, his founding of colleges, his refusal to tax them beyond reason. Yet in the great houses of England, there were whispers. A king who would not fight could be protected, or replaced. Beyond the chamber's arched windows, the bells of London tolled the hour. Henry lifted his head, eyes distant, as though hearing them from another world. The counselors leaned forward, hopeful for a word, a decision, any sign of resolve. But Henry's gaze drifted back to his book, and his lips began moving once more. In that moment, it was clear. The crown of England rested on a man both blessed and cursed, blessed with piety, cursed with a soul ill-matched to the brutal weight of kingship. And outside these walls, men were already deciding how long such a reign could last. Yet where the king's crown seemed a burden, there was another within those same walls who wore her resolve like armor. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf. If Henry VI was the stillness of a chapel at dawn, Margaret of Anjou was the slow, deliberate prowl of a hunting cat. She had crossed the Channel a bride, wrapped in silks and diplomacy, the living seal on a fragile truce between England and France. At 15, she was already accustomed to court intrigue. Her father's halls in Anjou had been a school where survival meant reading every flicker of the eyes, every tilt of the head. The English court she entered was colder, both in stone and in temperament. Many saw her as a foreign interloper, a French rose grafted onto an English stem. She noticed the way conversations would falter when she passed, how smiles thinned at the edges. But she also noticed something else. the quiet vacuum at the heart of the realm, a hollow where decisive power should have been. Margaret filled that space with purpose. She surrounded herself with men who understood loyalty not as courtesy, but as a weapon. Chief among them was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, shrewd, affable, and fiercely protective of her cause. Together they became the keystone of the Lancastrian faction, their influence threading through the council chambers like silk, or like wire. When Henry drifted into one of his vacant spells, Margaret did not wait for the kingdom to drift with him. She negotiated with lords, arranged alliances, and ensured her infant son Edward's position as heir was more than ceremonial. She knew the danger. Richard, Duke of York, stood only a few steps removed in the line of succession, and he was a man who could turn loyalty into rebellion if provoked. Those who opposed her learned quickly that the Queen's patience had edges sharp enough to cut. She was not reckless. She preferred to move as a shadow does before the strike, letting her enemies believe they were safe until the walls closed in. To friends, she was gracious, intelligent, even magnetic. To rivals, she was an unrelenting force that could not be charmed, bribed, or cowed. In the winter halls of Westminster, while the king prayed, Margaret's eyes were fixed on the map of England, each shire a square on a chessboard. She thought not in days or weeks, but in seasons and years. For her, the crown was not merely a symbol. It was a fortress wall against chaos, a promise to her son that his inheritance would not be stolen in the night. Outside, London's frost-bound streets gave no hint of the gathering heat within the palace. But those who looked closely could see it. Behind the Queen's measured smile was the quiet blaze of someone who had already chosen her battlefield. But beyond the Queen's guarded smiles and the candlelit corridors of Westminster, another will was hardening in the cold, a will that bore the name of York. The shadow of the House of York. Far from Westminster's cloistered halls, in the fortified city of Ludlow, Richard, Duke of York, studied England as one studies a game board before the first move. The map before him was not parchment. It was the land itself, etched into his mind by years of service, exile, and return. His claim to the throne was no whispered rumor. It was written in bloodlines. Descended through both his father and mother from the royal house of Edward III, Richard's lineage was as pure, some would argue purer, than Henry VI's. But for now, he wore no crown. He wore patience like armor. The years had seasoned him. He had fought in France, governed in Normandy, and endured the humiliation of political banishment when the Queen's allies feared his influence. Exile had not dulled him. It had tempered him. In the stone chambers of Ludlow Castle, by the flicker of torchlight, he listened to reports from his agents, tidings of unrest in the shires, of noble houses shifting their allegiances like pieces on a board, of the Queen's growing circle tightening around the king. Richard was not a man to waste breath on anger. Anger clouded judgment, and judgment was the one weapon he could wield without the expense of blood, at least for now. When he spoke, his words were measured, his tone as calm as winter ice. But beneath that calm lay a current, deep and relentless, pulling him toward the throne he did not yet openly seek. He was not alone in his designs. By his side stood men whose loyalty was tied not only to his cause, but to the promise of a kingdom restored to strength. The Nevilles, Richard, Earl of Salisbury, and his son, Richard, Earl of Warwick, were more than allies. They were the scaffolding on which the Yorkist cause could be built. Together they spoke of governance, of the decay they saw in Lancastrian rule, of the need for a hand both steady and decisive to guide England's future. In the quiet hours before dawn, Richard would walk the castle battlements, the frost crunching under his boots. From those heights the Welsh hills rolled away into darkness, and the wind carried with it the scent of wood smoke from distant villages. He would pause, gaze north, and imagine the crown, not as a gilded ornament, but as the keystone of the realm's survival. The shadow of the House of York was not yet a storm, but it was lengthening, stretching eastward toward London. And for those who could read the signs, it was clear. Once this shadow touched the walls of Westminster, England's long peace would shatter. Yet the tension between Queen and Duke was only the most visible crack in the realm's facade. Beneath it lay older fractures, deep in the kingdom's foundations, waiting for the right moment to give way. Deep-rooted causes. Long before swords were drawn and banners unfurled, the seeds of England's civil war had been sown in soil tilled by decades of tension. The realm's unrest was not born in a single quarrel between Queen and Duke, but in the tangled roots of dynasty, defeat, and discontent. The first root lay in the crown itself, and the question of who had the stronger right to wear it. Henry VI's title rested on the victories of his father, Henry V, and the Lancastrian seizure of power from Richard II 2 generations earlier. That seizure had never fully been forgiven by all the realm's nobles. To some, the House of Lancaster wore the crown as usurpers, and in Richard, Duke of York, they saw a bloodline that, through both the Mortimer and York lines, might restore the true succession. The second route ran through the mud of foreign battlefields. The 100 Years' War had drained England's coffers and its pride. In the 1440s and early 1450s, the loss of Normandy and Gascony, lands held for generations, struck like a blow to the nation's very identity. Veterans returned not with spoils, but with scars and empty hands. Their loyalty could be bought by any lord with coin enough to hire them, and many great houses maintained private armies as large as the king's own. The third route was economic. Years of war spending, coupled with poor harvests and disrupted trade, had left merchants restless and peasants burdened. Inflation gnawed at markets, while the crown's inability, or unwillingness, to enforce justice in the shires allowed local magnates to dominate law and order. The king's peace was, in many counties, a hollow phrase. The fourth route was personal factionalism. At court, rivalries hardened into camps. The Lancastrians, gathered around Queen Margaret and her trusted allies like Somerset, and the Yorkists, whose loyalty to Richard was matched only by their mistrust of the Queen. Between these factions lay not compromise, but an ever-widening gulf of suspicion, each side convinced the other sought to destroy it. Finally, there was the fragile man at the heart of it all. Henry VI's piety, admirable in a monk, was ill-suited to the hard calculus of kingship. His bouts of mental illness left a vacuum into which others stepped, and once a realm learns it can function without its king, the question of whether it needs him at all becomes easier to ask. These were the deep causes, invisible to the crowds in London's streets, yet relentless in their pressure. Together they formed a fault line beneath the kingdom's surface, and like all such lines, it would take only the right shock to make it split wide open. But fault lines alone do not bring down kingdoms. They need the tremor that sets them shaking. And in England, that first jolt was about to arrive. Immediate causes. The fault lines beneath England's peace had been forming for years, but in the mid-1450s, the tremors began. The long brewing tensions between Lancaster and York no longer whispered in council chambers. They were spoken aloud in the marketplaces, the taverns, and even in the guarded words of the shire courts. The first and most decisive spark was the king's collapse in 1453. Henry VI, already prone to long silences, fell into a catatonic state that lasted over a year. He neither spoke nor recognized his newborn son, Edward of Westminster. The image of the king, pale, vacant-eyed, unable to lift the scepter, spread quietly through the realm, carried in the guarded voices of messengers and the unease of nobles. In this vacuum, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm. For a brief moment, England seemed to find a steady hand. Laws were enforced, order restored in parts of the north, and York's allies, most notably the Nevilles, took key positions. But every decision he made tightened the coil of resentment in the Lancastrian camp. When Henry recovered in 1454, he returned to a court transformed. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, moved swiftly to restore her faction's dominance. York was dismissed from the Protectorate. His allies were removed from office, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the Queen's staunch supporter, returned to favor. The second spark came from blood, not in battle, but in the street. In May 1455, a bitter feud between the Nevilles and the powerful Percy family in the north erupted into open violence. This private war between great houses mirrored the larger division between York and Lancaster, drawing more lords into choosing sides. Margaret's determination to secure her son's inheritance sharpened the conflict. To her, York's power during the king's illness had been a warning, and perhaps a rehearsal, for usurpation. To York, her moves after Henry's recovery were nothing less than an attempt to destroy him and his allies entirely. By spring 1455, the realm was a tinderbox. Retinues were mustered under the pretext of self-defense, but every man knew these were armies in all but name. The roads between London and the Midlands carried more armed riders than merchants. Letters were sealed not with greetings but with calls to rally, and so the invisible war became visible. Two camps, Red Rose and White, moved toward each other with the slow, inexorable force of colliding storms. The first clash was no longer a matter of if, but where. That answer would come soon, on a field near a small town called St. Albans. But storms rarely announce themselves with the first clap of thunder. They gather, swirl, and tighten until the air itself demands release. In the spring of 1455, that pressure found its outlet, summoning the council. In the spring of 1455, London stirred under a tension that could not be named without fear. The city's streets were busy with merchants and apprentices, but every conversation carried the same undertone, the sense that something decisive was about to happen. In Westminster Palace, the Great Council of England had been called to meet. The summons bore the king's seal, yet all knew the hand behind it was Queen Margaret's. The stated purpose was to settle disputes and restore unity. The true purpose, whispered among York's men, was to isolate the Duke, strip him of influence, and perhaps strike before he could strike back. Richard of York read the summons with measured calm, though those close to him saw the shadow in his eyes. To ignore the council would be to admit rebellion. To attend unprepared would be to walk into a snare. He chose a third path. He would come, but not alone. Riders left Ludlow in the night, carrying messages to Salisbury and Warwick. By the time York's party began its slow march toward London, hundreds of armed retainers rode with them, their livery bright against the late spring countryside. In the royal circle, preparations were quieter but no less deliberate. Somerset, restored to favor, advised the king with the smooth confidence of a man certain of his cause. Margaret moved through the palace like a commander arranging her lines, ensuring that those who owed her allegiance would be present in the chamber and ready to speak when called. The council was to meet in St. Albans, a market town north of London. Neutral in name, it was in truth chosen for its narrow streets and easily guarded approaches. Its timber-framed houses leaned toward the road as if eavesdropping, their upper stories casting shadows where armed men could be hidden. As the appointed day drew near, the roads filled with banners, the white rose of York, the red of Lancaster, traveling toward the same destination. Farmers paused in their fields to watch the processions pass, the jingling of harness and the muted clatter of hooves, a reminder that war often arrives dressed in ceremony. Henry VI himself prepared without urgency, trusting in his office to command obedience. But those who looked past the king's gentle demeanor saw the truth. This was not a council convened to prevent conflict. It was the stage upon which England's first open blow in the Wars of the Roses would be struck. But councils, like storms, can change their nature before they break. What had been called as a meeting of words was already hardening into a meeting of steel. Preparing for war. By the time the council's appointed day approached, the pretense of peaceful negotiation had thinned to the width of a blade. The banners moving toward St. Albans were no longer mere tokens of honor. They were declarations of readiness. Richard, Duke of York, knew that to arrive at the council's door with only words would be folly. His messengers had ridden hard through the shires, summoning every retainer loyal to his cause. From the marches came weathered men who had fought the Welsh. From the north rode the Neville's household troops, their armor polished, yet bearing the dents of old feuds. They gathered in disciplined columns, the white rose stitched onto surcoats, the hiss of bowstrings being tested audible in the spring air. In Warwick's camp, preparations had the air of practiced ritual. The Earl, already earning the name the Kingmaker in whispers, walked among his men, checking arrowheads, inspecting spear shafts, speaking in the low, even tone of a commander who knew both the stakes and the skill of his followers. Tents were pitched in neat rows, sentries placed with the precision of a tournament, though every man knew this would be no sport. The Lancastrian camp was no less active. Somerset, seasoned in politics, if not always in war, oversaw the gathering of loyalist forces. The red rose of Lancaster flew from lances and pavilion tops, bright against the green fields. Men-at-arms drilled in the meadows outside town, the clanging of their practice blows carrying over the hedgerows. Within the Queen's circle, courtiers moved like chess pieces, arranging alliances, drafting oaths of loyalty that might soon be tested in blood. Henry VI alone seemed untouched by the fever of preparation. His thoughts, gentle and inward, rested on the hope that the council might resolve matters without strife. Yet even his personal guard moved with heavier steps, their hands closer to their sword hilts. Merchants and villagers in St. Albans watched uneasily as armed companies arrived from both directions, filling the inns, spilling into the churchyards, and posting watchmen at crossroads. The narrow streets that once echoed with the cries of market day now heard the metallic rhythm of armor plates and the creak of longbow staves bending under draw. By dawn on the eve of the council, the air between the two camps felt charged, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The white rose and the red had come within sight of each other. And though the king still spoke of reconciliation, those who stood at the edge of the fields could already sense the truth. St. Albans would not host a council. It would host a reckoning. And so, as the sun lifted higher over the rooftops of St. Albans, the silence between the two camps thinned to the breaking point, a stillness so taut it could only end in the roar of war. The Battle of St. Albans, 1455. The calm of late morning shattered with the blare of trumpets. York's envoys had returned empty-handed, and Warwick, reading the moment like a man sensing the wind before a storm, gave the order. The Yorkist lines surged forward, their banners snapping, the white rose visible above the crush of helms and pikes. The streets of St. Albans became instant battlegrounds. Lancastrian defenders held the market approaches with shield walls, spears braced in the mud-packed earth. Archers, stationed in the upper rooms of inns and houses, loosed shafts into the advancing Yorkist ranks. Arrows thudded into oak shields, rattled against steel, and found the occasional gap with deadly effect. Warwick countered with precision. He sent his men through gardens, breaching fences and kicking in back doors to flush out the bowmen above. Skirmishes broke out in cramped parlors and narrow yards, the fighting so close that the air reeked of sweat, blood, and the splintering of timber. In the center, Somerset directed the defense with fierce determination. He knew the town's lanes could work to his advantage, choke points where numbers mattered less than nerve. Yet the Yorkist push was relentless. Warwick himself led a flanking charge that spilled suddenly into the rear of Somerset's position, throwing his men into confusion. A melee erupted near the Castle Inn, where the king's standard flew. The clash of steel rang off the timbered walls, punctuated by the shouts of captains trying to rally their men. In the chaos, Somerset found himself cut off. The Duke of York's men pressed in, and in the shadow of the market cross, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, fell beneath a flurry of blows. His death, swift and brutal, was the first noble blood spilled in what would become decades of war. With their commander gone, Lancastrian resistance crumbled. Yorkist forces pushed through to the king's lodging. Henry VI was found unhurt but surrounded, his gentle confusion at odds with the carnage around him. Warwick ensured no harm came to the monarch. The battle had never been against the crown itself, but against those who steered it. By mid-afternoon, the Red Rose was in retreat, the White Rose standing victorious in the streets. The Battle of St. Albans was brief, fierce, and decisive. Its legacy would be far longer. The first act of open war between Lancaster and York was now written in blood, and England would not soon see peace again. And when the din of steel finally faded, the silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself, a silence broken only by the grim tally of what had been lost. Aftermath and shockwaves. The streets of St. Albans lay strewn with the wreckage of sudden war. Broken arrows jutted from splintered door frames, overturned market stalls lay scattered across the square, and the red trickle of blood followed the cobblestones into the gutters. The smell of iron and smoke hung over the town like a low cloud. Henry VI was escorted from the Castle Inn under the watchful eyes of Warwick's men, the royal standard lowered but not torn. The king's face bore no trace of fear, only the pale bewilderment of a man whose mind could not follow the speed of events. To the Yorkist lords, his safekeeping was essential, not as a captive to humiliate, but as a sovereign to reclaim. Richard, Duke of York, stepped forward in the market square, his armor scored with scratches, his cloak marked with the grime of battle. Before the assembled captains and townsfolk peering from behind half-open shutters, he bowed to the king, pledging loyalty even as his enemies' bodies cooled on the cobblestones. It was a carefully crafted image, one that would echo through chroniclers' accounts. York, as the faithful servant forced into arms for the good of the realm. The death of Somerset was more than the fall of a man. It was the collapse of a political order. For years he had been the keystone of Lancastrian governance, the one constant in the shifting court. Now, his body lay under a hastily drawn shroud, and with it, the authority of the Queen's party faltered. Margaret of Anjou, far from the field, would receive the news like a thunderclap, and she would not forgive. By evening, Yorkist banners hung over the town gates, and messengers rode in all directions. In London, the merchants would hear of a swift, decisive victory. In the shires, rumors would swell into legend. Yet beneath the outward show of control, the victors knew the truth. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. The bells of St. Albans tolled that night, not for celebration, but for the souls lost in the day's fighting. Fires burned low in the Yorkist camp as soldiers spoke in hushed tones, some exulting in the triumph, others uneasy at having struck down the king's men in the heart of England. The Battle of St. Albans had lasted only hours, but its shockwaves would ripple through the realm for years. The realm had tasted civil blood, and as every veteran of that day knew, the first taste rarely proved the last. But while the streets of St. Albans fell silent under Yorkist banners, far from the blood-stained market square another heart began to beat with purpose. The Queen's fury. In the great hall of Greenwich Palace, the news arrived like a blade sliding silently between ribs. Margaret of Anjou stood motionless as the messenger recited the details. The king unharmed but in Yorkist hands, Somerset dead in the market square of St. Albans, her loyal captains scattered or slain. The words were formal, measured, but each syllable struck with the force of betrayal and blood. The Queen's eyes did not flash with sudden rage. Instead, they darkened, as though a shadow had passed over the sun. She dismissed the court attendants with a flick of her hand, leaving only her most trusted allies, a circle of faces grim and expectant. Margaret moved to the window, staring out over the Thames, the river's calm surface mocking the storm that gathered in her mind. For years she had fought, not only to uphold her husband's authority, but to shield their son's inheritance. Every intrigue, every alliance, every carefully chosen word had been for that purpose. Now, York's victory had ripped the veil from the game. There would be no peace bought with compromise. The Duke had shown his willingness to spill royal blood to shape the Crown's council. Margaret's voice, when it came, was low but steady. Orders were given, loyal lords summoned, safe routes plotted, and envoys dispatched to gather men in the north, where Lancastrian loyalty still ran deep. She spoke not of revenge in the crude sense, but of justice, the restoration of rightful rule. Yet those who listened understood the steel beneath the words. Her mind moved with the precision of a commander mapping a campaign. The Yorkists might hold the king, but they could not hold the hearts of England entire. Every noble slighted by York's rise, every household bound to the red rose by blood or marriage, these she would call to her banner, and she would not strike in haste. Beyond the palace walls, London bustled unaware of the full weight of the Queen's resolve. Merchants still haggled in the markets, barges drifted along the river, and children played in the narrow lanes. Yet those who served at court carried a new tension in their steps, sensing that a greater storm than St. Albans was coming. Margaret of Anjou had suffered a blow that would have broken a lesser figure. Instead, it had hardened her. In the silent hours before dawn, she stood alone in the hall, the torchlight catching the gold embroidery of her gown, and vowed that the white rose would be made to bleed for every drop spilled that day. But even as Margaret's vow hardened in the torchlit silence of Greenwich, events were already set in motion that would carry her north, toward the field where her cause would draw first. Decisive blood. The Battle of Wakefield, 1460. The winter of 1460 lay heavy over England, its fields frost-hardened, its skies the color of lead. But beneath the frozen earth, old grudges stirred like roots seeking light. Margaret of Anjou's months of quiet labor bore fruit. The north rose for Lancaster. Pennants bearing the red rose rippled above castle walls from York to Durham, and musters were called in towns where the Queen's name still carried weight. By late December, the Duke of York rode north from London, his confidence sharpened by recent victories. He had been named protector once more, his hand on the tiller of the realm. But power, once grasped, demands constant proof. News of Margaret's rallying in the north could not be ignored. York, ever the man of action, gathered his household troops and loyal retainers, marching to stamp out the embers before they became flame. At Sandal Castle, overlooking the River Calder, York took winter quarters. The castle's towers stood stark against a pale sky, its stones rimmed with frost. Scouts brought reports of Lancastrian forces massing nearby under the command of Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, joined by the fierce Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, men with blood debts to settle. Yet York's army was smaller than expected. The northern lords had been slower to join him than his pride allowed him to admit. The snow-dusted days passed in uneasy stalemate. From the battlements, York's men could see the flicker of distant campfires, too many for comfort. His allies urged caution, to wait for reinforcements. But on the morning of December 30th, the air carried a strange quiet, the kind that makes a commander feel both opportunity and danger. Whether spurred by a belief that the enemy was weaker than reported, or by the pull of honor and impatience, York made his choice. Banners unfurled in the brittle wind as the Yorkist column marched out from Sandal Castle into the open fields. Frost crunched beneath boots and hooves. The white rose gleamed against a sky smudged with winter haze. Yet from the hedgerows and the folds of the land, the Lancastrians appeared, not a scattered host, but a coordinated force, surging forward like wolves scenting blood. The trap closed swiftly. Clifford's men struck from one flank, Northumberland's from the other, driving wedges into York's formation. Shouts and the clang of steel filled the cold air. mingled with the muffled thud of bodies falling onto frozen ground. Archers loosed volleys into the mass, shafts dark against the pale horizon. In the chaos, York fought like the soldier he had once been in France, sword rising and falling, his voice carrying above the din. But numbers told their own truth. His men, pressed on all sides, began to break. The winter earth turned dark where blood melted the frost. The Duke's household knights formed a ring around him, deflecting blows, but the Lancastrian tide was unstoppable. At last, York was dragged from his horse, his armor dented, his helm torn away. Chroniclers would later disagree on whether he fell in the crush or was taken alive. What is certain is that by the day's end, Richard, Duke of York, lay dead on the field. The aftermath was as deliberate as the battle had been swift. His head, crowned mockingly with a paper crown, was set above Micklegate Bar in York, a grim warning to all who would challenge the Red Rose. The death of York was not merely the fall of a man, it was the shattering of the Yorkist claim's first figurehead. Margaret's allies rejoiced at the victory, yet they knew this was not the end. The Duke's death was a spark cast into dry tinder. South of the Humber, York's son Edward was already gathering men, his will hardened by the sight of his father's fate. And Warwick, the Kingmaker, would not let the balance tilt without answer. The snows of Wakefield buried the dead in silence, but they could not cover what had been unleashed. The war, once a struggle of courtly factions, had become a vendetta written in blood and crowned in vengeance. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that spring would bring not renewal, but reckoning. But the snows of Wakefield, though they buried York's body, could not bury his cause. In the south, the shock of his death was already hardening into resolve, and a new champion was about to step forward. Edward IV rises. Winter's grip on England did not loosen with the turning of the year. The snow lay thick along the roads, muffling the land, but in the south, news moved faster than the frost. From Castle Hall to village hearth, word of the disaster at Wakefield spread. Richard, Duke of York, slain, his head mounted on Micklegate Bar. For the Lancastrians, it was a victory. For the Yorkists, a wound that cut to the bone. In London, Warwick the Kingmaker stood in the great hall of Baynard's castle when the messengers arrived. His jaw tightened as the details spilled out. York dead, Salisbury executed, and the Queen's army swelling. The cause that had seemed so close to triumph now stood on the edge of ruin. Yet even in that bleak hour, Warwick saw a path forward, and it lay in the figure of York's eldest son. Edward, Earl of March, was barely 18, tall enough to stand above most men in the crowd, his broad shoulders promising the strength of a warrior. The blood of both York and Mortimer ran in his veins, a double claim to the throne that could match the Queen's ambitions. Where his father had carried himself with the air of a statesman-soldier, Edward radiated something different, a vigor that caught the eye and stirred the heart. When Edward received the news of his father's death, the grief was sharp but quickly forged into purpose. There was no time to mourn. The Queen's armies were on the move, and the cause needed a leader who could fight, inspire, and win. His gaze was steady when he swore, before his captains, that the white rose would not wither with his father's fall. Fate gave him little time to prove himself. In early February, a Lancastrian force under Jasper Tudor marched toward the Welsh borders, hoping to crush Yorkist resistance in the west. Edward met them at Mortimer's Cross, where icy winds cut across the frosted fields. On the morning of battle, a rare winter sundog appeared in the sky, 3 suns shining through the haze. Murmurs rippled through the ranks, some calling it an omen of doom. Edward seized the moment, riding before his men and declaring it a sign of divine favor. 3 suns for the sons of York, united in purpose. The cheers rolled like thunder across the line. The battle that followed was hard-fought and bloody. Edward's presence in the melee was unmistakable, a towering figure, his sword cutting arcs of steel through the press. By day's end, the Lancastrians broke and fled, their leaders scattered. It was a victory that did more than secure the border. It announced Edward as a commander in his own right. Meanwhile, Warwick moved to hold London against the Queen's advance. At the Second Battle of St. Albans, he failed, the Lancastrians retaking the king and driving the Yorkists from the field. But the victory came at a cost. Margaret's army, burdened by the baggage of war and the fearsome reputation of her northern troops, found the gates of London closed to them. The city, wary of pillage, turned instead to Edward and Warwick. In March 1461, Edward entered London in triumph, the streets lined with merchants, apprentices, and nobles eager to see the young heir. His victories in the field and the Queen's alienation of the capital tipped the scales. A council convened, and in the Hall of Westminster, Edward was proclaimed King of England, Edward IV. The cheers that followed seemed to shake the rafters, yet beneath the jubilation lay the knowledge that the crown was still contested, its gold shadowed by blood. Edward's rise had been meteoric, from heir in mourning to crowned king in less than 3 months. But the road ahead led inevitably to battle, for the red rose had not yet been plucked from the field. The Queen's forces gathered in the north, a storm waiting to break, and Edward knew that his new crown would hold only as firmly as his sword arm could defend it. The snow began to melt, the roads turning to mud. Across the land, men sharpened blades, fletched arrows, and stitched banners. The largest battle England had ever seen was coming, and its outcome would decide whether Edward's ascent was the dawn of a new reign, or the last bright flare before darkness returned. The snows of winter had begun to soften, but England's heart was still gripped by war. And as Edward's crown was yet untested, the road north would lead him to a reckoning that would be written in blood at Towton. Towton. The Bloody Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, 29th March, 1461. Dawn broke over the rolling fields of Yorkshire beneath a sky the color of pewter. A bitter wind swept across the ridges, carrying with it flecks of snow that stung the skin like sand. Beneath that bleak light, 2 armies faced each other, the White Rose of York against the Red Rose of Lancaster. Tens of thousands strong, the largest gathering of armed men England had ever seen. Edward IV, not yet 19, stood among his captains on the slope of a hill near Towton. His armor gleamed dully in the winter light, the cold seeping into the steel. Around him banners cracked in the wind, their colors muted by frost. Beyond the ridge, the Lancastrians under Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, held the higher ground, their lines a dark mass against the whiteness. Between them lay a no-man's land already churned to mud by marching feet. The air was tense, each side waiting for the other to commit. Then, like a signal from some unseen hand, the wind shifted, blowing hard into the faces of the Lancastrians. Edward's archers stepped forward, planting their feet in the frozen soil. Arrows hissed through the air, the wind carrying them farther than expected. The first volleys struck deep into the enemy's line, men falling before they could close the distance. Somerset ordered a counter-volley, but the wind betrayed them. Shafts fell short, clattering harmlessly into the slush. Edward seized the advantage. "Forward!" he commanded, and the Yorkist archers advanced, loosing again and again until the air seemed filled with black rain. Enraged, the Lancastrians surged downhill, the ground shaking under the weight of their charge. The lines met with a crash like breaking timber, the clash of steel drowned by the roar of men locked in mortal struggle. The snow turned red underfoot. Blades caught on armor, splintered on shields, and found their mark in the gaps. The battle raged for hours, the front line swaying like a living thing, first one side giving ground, then the other. Edward, towering above his men, fought in the thick of it, his great sword rising and falling in a rhythm as relentless as the winter wind. Beside him, Warwick and Lord Fauconberg drove their contingents forward, urging the men to hold. By afternoon, the fighting had become a test of endurance as much as skill. Exhaustion dragged at limbs, and the cries of the wounded cut through the snow-laden air. Then, through the haze, the Yorkist reinforcements arrived. The troops of John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, emerging on the flank. The sudden pressure collapsed the Lancastrian line. Panic rippled through their ranks, and retreat became rout. The snowstorm, which had been a silent witness, now became a weapon. Fleeing Lancastrians stumbled in the drifts, their pursuers cutting them down without quarter. The narrow crossing at the River Cock turned into a slaughter, the icy waters running crimson as men fell, were trampled, or drowned under the press. Chroniclers would later speak of corpses piled high enough to serve as makeshift bridges. By nightfall, the field was silent, save for the moan of the wind over the dead. Estimates of the fallen varied, but all agreed on one truth. Towton was the bloodiest single day in English history. The snow lay thick over the slain, white petals scattered over a field of roses, red and white alike. Edward had won not just a battle, but the throne beyond challenge. The Lancastrian cause lay broken in the north. Henry VI and Margaret fled toward Scotland. Yet the price was steep. As Edward rode through the aftermath, past the faces of men who had followed him into legend and would follow no more, the weight of kingship settled heavier on his shoulders. The crown he had claimed was no longer a prize of ambition. It was a burden paid for in the blood of thousands. Towton ended the first act of the Wars of the Roses, but not the war itself. The snow would melt, the rivers run clear again, and in time the red rose would bloom anew. But for now, Edward IV reigned, young, victorious, and crowned not by ceremony alone, but by the terrible verdict of the battlefield. Towton had crowned Edward in snow and blood. But even as the battlefield faded into memory, the shaping of his reign would move from open fields to the shadowed chambers of power, where another figure, the Kingmaker, waited. Warwick. The Kingmaker. The snows of Towton had barely melted when a new season of power began. Across England, the battered banners of Lancaster were lowered, and the white rose of York was raised in their place. Edward IV, not yet 20, wore the crown with the easy confidence of youth. But behind the throne, in the shadowed halls of influence, stood a man whose hand had helped place it there. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. Warwick was no ordinary noble. Towering in stature, broad-shouldered, and with the commanding presence of a general, he had been the driving force of Yorkist fortunes for a decade. His fortune came not only from his sword, but from his wealth. Vast estates stretching from the Midlands to the northern marches, revenues from Calais, and the loyalty of men who would follow him through fire. To many, Warwick was not simply a servant of the crown, he was the crown's architect. It had been Warwick who rallied the London merchants to Edward's cause, who brokered alliances among the fractious nobility, who commanded fleets and armies with equal skill. His influence in council was unmatched, his voice carrying more weight than most peers combined. Foreign envoys arriving at Westminster often sought Warwick's audience before they ever approached the young king, for they knew the Kingmaker's favor could open doors, and his disfavor could shut them forever. Yet Edward IV, though grateful for Warwick's service, was no puppet. The battlefield had taught him to lead, and the crown had given him a taste for independence. Where Warwick saw himself as the guiding hand, Edward began to see himself as the master of his own destiny. This subtle shift, almost invisible at first, would, in time, grow into a rift. For now, their partnership held. Together, they worked to consolidate Yorkist rule. Warwick, as captain of Calais, ensured control of the Channel and kept French ambitions in check. His fleets harried pirates. His diplomacy sought to bind Burgundy and France to Yorkist interests. Edward, meanwhile, moved to pacify the north and redistribute lands stripped from Lancastrian loyalists to those who had stood with him at Towton. But in the halls of Westminster and the streets of London, whispers began. Some called Warwick the true king, a dangerous flattery that reached Edward's ears. Others questioned whether a crown so recently won could endure with two centers of power, one in the throne room, the other in the Kingmaker's house. Warwick, for his part, believed the strength of the realm lay in the bonds he forged. He envisioned Edward marrying a French princess, securing an alliance to deter any Lancastrian restoration. The match he pursued was with Bona of Savoy, sister-in-law to King Louis XI of France, a union that would cement Warwick's role as the architect of both war and peace. But Edward's heart, and perhaps his pride, pulled in another direction, a choice that would soon shake the very foundations of their alliance. That storm had not yet broken, but the skies were darkening. Beneath the surface of victory, tensions coiled like a spring. For the moment, the realm saw only the facade, the young warrior king and the seasoned lord standing side by side, symbols of Yorkist strength. Yet the nature of kingship is such that power shared is power divided. Warwick, master of intrigue and Kingmaker of England, had raised Edward high. Whether he could keep him there, or whether the pupil would outgrow the teacher, was a question the coming years would answer in blood and betrayal. Towton had secured Edward's crown in blood, but battles are not only fought with swords. In the months that followed, the struggle for England's future moved from muddy fields to gilded chambers, and there, a choice of the heart would ignite a war of loyalties. The marriage that shook the throne. Spring of 1464 found Edward IV at the height of his early reign, young, victorious, and admired. His court glittered with the spoils of war, and the streets of London rang with songs in his honor. Yet even in this season of triumph, the king carried a secret that would soon burst into the open, altering the course of the Wars of the Roses and driving a wedge between him and the man who had made him king. Warwick, ever the strategist, had labored tirelessly to arrange a marriage that would bind England to France. His choice, Bona of Savoy, offered not only royal blood but the promise of peace with Louis XI. The negotiations were delicate, the diplomacy painstaking. Warwick's confidence was absolute. The match would elevate Edward in Europe, strengthen the Yorkist cause, and secure Warwick's own prestige as the architect of royal fortune. But Edward was not a man to be ruled by strategy alone. In the quiet months following Towton, during a progress through the Midlands, he had encountered Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of striking beauty and undeniable charm. She was no foreign princess, but the widowed daughter of Sir Richard Woodville, a Lancastrian knight, and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Her husband had died fighting for the Red Rose. She was, by all accounts, an improbable candidate for queen, older than Edward by several years, with 2 sons from her first marriage, and no great dowry to speak of. What she did possess was a rare combination of poise, intelligence, and dignity that captivated the young king. Chroniclers would later embroider the tale, how Edward courted her in secret, how she refused to be his mistress, and how her steadfastness only deepened his resolve. Whatever the precise truth, by May 1st, 1464, Edward had married Elizabeth in a small, private ceremony at her family home in Grafton Regis. No fanfare, no noble witnesses, only a few attendants sworn to silence. The news, when it reached Warwick, landed like a cannon shot. Months of diplomacy with France collapsed overnight. The French court, slighted and insulted, cooled toward England. Warwick's enemies in council whispered that the Kingmaker's influence was waning. For Edward, the marriage was both an act of passion and of assertion. By choosing for himself, he declared to the realm, and to Warwick, that he was no longer the apprentice in statecraft. But the political cost was immense. Elizabeth's large family, ambitious and eager, began to rise swiftly in royal favor. Her brothers and sisters secured advantageous marriages to the nobility. Her kin filled offices and posts. To the older aristocracy, especially Warwick, this influx of new men felt like an invasion of the royal court. Tension hardened into resentment. Warwick, who had risked all to place Edward on the throne, now found himself sidelined, his counsel spurned. The rift was no longer hidden. It spread in whispers through the corridors of Westminster and in the letters of foreign envoys. Yet for Edward, the choice had been worth the storm. Elizabeth, crowned at Westminster in May 1465, became a queen whose elegance and dignity impressed even her detractors. She bore Edward airs and stood at his side as a symbol of stability in a court increasingly defined by faction. But the damage to his alliance with Warwick was done. The Kingmaker, once the indispensable pillar of the Yorkist cause, began to look elsewhere for influence, and perhaps in time for a new king. The seeds of betrayal had been sown not on the battlefield, but at the altar. And as the seasons turned, the uneasy peace of Edward's early reign began to fray, its threads pulled apart by personal pride, political rivalry, and the quiet certainty that in England's Game of Thrones, loyalty was a currency that could be spent, or lost, in a single act of defiance. But the fracture between king and kingmaker, once a hairline crack, was now widening into a fault line. And soon, the quiet discord of court would erupt into open treachery. Warwick's betrayal. By the late 1460s, the alliance that had once been the spine of Yorkist power was rotting from within. Edward IV sat on the throne by right of victory, but Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, now stood apart, his pride curdled into bitterness. The French alliance, painstakingly woven, lay in tatters. In its place came a marriage that had elevated not Warwick's carefully chosen partner, but Elizabeth Woodville, and with her a family of hungry new courtiers who devoured posts, lands, and titles with alarming speed. For Warwick, it was not only an insult to his judgment, it was a challenge to his place at the heart of power. In council, the slights multiplied. Decisions were made without him. Ambassadors bypassed him for the king's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The Woodvilles tightened their hold, their alliances spreading through noble marriages like vines through an old stone wall. Warwick, who had once been the architect of the realm, now felt himself shut out of the very house he had built. His resentment found fertile ground in Clarence, Edward's ambitious younger brother. Charismatic but discontented, Clarence chafed under his brother's rule, especially as Edward denied him the royal match he desired. Warwick offered what Edward would not: influence, opportunity, and the promise of a future shaped by their own hands. The two men became allies in disaffection, the Kingmaker and the king's own blood plotting against the crown. In secret, Warwick opened channels to his old enemies, the Lancastrians. Through veiled messages and cautious intermediaries, he reached out to Margaret of Anjou, the fierce exiled queen who had once sworn to see York destroyed. The terms were unthinkable to the loyal, but Warwick was no longer bound by loyalty. In exchange for restoring her husband, Henry VI, to the throne, Margaret would betroth her son, Edward of Westminster, to Warwick's daughter. The betrayal was more than political. It was personal. Edward IV had trusted Warwick with his life on the battlefield, his counsel in the council chamber. Now the Kingmaker's loyalty bent toward a rival king, a man they had fought to depose. By 1469, rebellion flared. Warwick and Clarence stirred uprisings in the north, exploiting grievances over taxation, corruption, and the perceived arrogance of the Woodville faction. The rebels marched under banners of justice for the commonweal, but their true aim was to fracture Edward's rule. Skirmishes bled into pitched battles, and Edward's hold on the realm wavered. In the summer of that year, the unthinkable happened. Warwick captured the king. Edward IV, the warrior of Towton, the man crowned through fire and snow, was taken prisoner by the very hand that had once crowned him. For a moment, Warwick held all the threads of power again, but even the Kingmaker could not rule in another man's name for long. The great lords balked at a noble ruling without a monarch. and unrest forced Warwick to release Edward before the year was out. It might have ended there, a failed rebellion, a bitter reconciliation. But pride, once wounded, rarely heals. Warwick fled abroad, to the court of Louis XI of France, where the final act of treachery took shape. Under the watchful eyes of the Spider King, Warwick and Margaret of Anjou sealed their pact. York and Lancaster, enemies for more than a decade, would join forces to topple Edward. When Warwick returned to England in 1470, it was not as the king's ally, but as his conqueror-in-waiting, his sails filled with French wind, his banners bearing the red rose. And in the turbulent months to come, England would learn that a king made by another man could just as easily be unmade. But Warwick's return under the red rose banner was not the end of Edward's reign. It was the beginning of his darkest chapter, one that would drive the king from his own realm and into the uncertain road of exile. The King in Exile. Autumn of 1470 brought storms, not just over the Channel, but across the crown of England itself. Edward IV, once the golden conqueror of Towton, found himself caught in a tempest of betrayal and shifting loyalties. The alliance of Warwick the Kingmaker and Margaret of Anjou, sealed under the watchful gaze of Louis XI, was no idle pact. It was a weapon forged for one purpose: to drive Edward from his throne. The first blows fell with alarming precision. Warwick landed on England's shores with seasoned men-at-arms and the authority of both Lancaster and France behind him. Towns opened their gates, nobles weighed the winds and found them blowing red. In the north, uprisings flared like sudden sparks. In the south, the Woodvilles, the Queen's kin and Edward's staunchest allies, were hunted and scattered. Even Edward's own blood turned against him. George, Duke of Clarence, once his brother-in-arms, now stood beside Warwick, proclaiming loyalty to the rightful king, Henry VI. The defection struck deeper than any spear. Edward gathered what forces he could, but the tide was against him. His network of support, so carefully built in victory, crumbled in days. London, sensing the shift, refused to hold for him. And so, under a sky bruised with autumn clouds, Edward IV abandoned his capital. The retreat was no royal procession. It was a desperate flight. From King's Lynn, Edward boarded a small vessel, the sea wind clawing at his cloak. With him went his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and a handful of loyal companions. Their destination was Burgundy, where Edward hoped to find refuge with his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold. The Channel was treacherous that season. Waves rose like walls, threatening to splinter the king's fragile escape. In the howling darkness, the line between ruler and fugitive blurred. Here was no court, no throne, only the raw taste of salt and the knowledge that England lay behind him, in the hands of his enemies. Back in London, Warwick's triumph was swift and calculated. Henry VI, the once deposed monarch, was led from the Tower and restored to the throne. The city watched in silence as the mild, half-broken figure shuffled through Westminster's halls. His reign, such as it was, existed in name only. Warwick ruled in all but title, the true power behind the hollow crown. For Edward, exile was a cold education. In the courts of Burgundy, he learned the bitter discipline of patience. He moved as a guest, not a sovereign, relying on the favor of Charles the Bold, who weighed every promise against his own ambitions in France. The exile king played the long game, gathering ships, money, and men, his mind fixed on the day he would return. But England itself was restless under Warwick's new order. The red rose and white sat uneasily together. Lancastrian exiles returned expecting reward. Yorkist loyalists bristled under suspicion. And over it all hung the unspoken truth. The Kingmaker had built a kingdom on a foundation of shifting sand. Winter crept across the Channel. In the flicker of candlelight, Edward would study the maps of his lost realm, the river bends of the Thames, the ridge of Towton, the streets of London. He knew them not as a tourist of memory, but as a soldier plotting his next campaign. Exile for Edward was not an ending. It was a pause. The sharp inhale before the clash of steel, the silence before the trumpet. And somewhere, beyond the cold gray sea, England waited for the return of its absent king, and for the reckoning that would come with him. But Warwick's hollow victory was already beginning to crack, and across the cold gray sea, the man he had unmade was preparing to return, not as a supplicant, but as a king reborn. The return of the King Winter in Burgundy had been long, but in the spring of 1471, Edward IV's patience ripened into action. The months of exile had hardened him, stripped away the careless brilliance of youth, and left in its place a colder, sharper resolve. He would not return as a fugitive begging for favor. He would return as a commander reclaiming what was his by right. The Burgundian court, glittering under the restless gaze of Charles the Bold, had grown weary of Warwick's alliance with France. The Kingmaker's pact with Louis XI threatened Burgundy's trade routes, and so Edward found a willing ear. Gold was counted, ships prepared, and a small but disciplined force gathered under the Yorkist banner. It was not an army to match Towton's host, barely 2,000 men when they left the harbors of Zealand. Yet the wind favored them, and in March Edward landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, the same desolate coast that had seen other exiled lords return to gamble their lives on English soil. The landing was no grand procession. There were no trumpets, no cheering crowds, only the crunch of boots on shingle and the salt wind biting at their cloaks. But Edward carried a weapon greater than numbers, the aura of a man who had been king and who meant to be so again. His first move was cautious. Proclaiming himself not as a conqueror but as the rightful Duke of York, Edward swore he sought only to reclaim his estates. It was an old ruse, designed to win the trust, or at least the neutrality, of those wary of open treason against Warwick's regime. Yet as he marched south, town after town opened its gates. Yorkist loyalists, who had endured the humiliation of Henry VI's restoration, began to rally. In Nottingham, his army swelled. In Coventry, he demanded Warwick's surrender, but the gates remained shut. The Kingmaker was not yet ready for open battle. Edward pressed on toward London, moving like a blade toward the heart. His brother Clarence, ever fickle, now saw the winds changing. The prodigal Duke rode into Edward's camp, pledging loyalty once more. Whether Edward forgave him in truth or only in necessity, none could say. But the reunion gave his cause both strength and legitimacy. London itself was a gamble. Warwick had left the capital in Henry VI's name, but the city's merchants had no love for instability. When Edward reached its gates, the people welcomed him as if the last year had been a passing shadow. Henry VI was quietly taken from the Tower and returned to confinement. In that moment, Edward was king again, not by coronation, but by the simple fact that the throne stood empty, and he was the man willing to claim it. But Warwick was marching. From the west, the Kingmaker advanced with Margaret of Anjou's forces moving to join him. The lines of fate, drawn in exile and betrayal, now converged toward a single point: Barnet. In the weeks ahead, Edward would have to fight not only for his crown, but for the survival of the Yorkist cause itself. The storm he had sailed into was now gathering on English soil, and this time there would be no retreat across the Channel. The king who had returned was not the same as the youth who had once triumphed at Towton. This Edward was leaner, more dangerous, a man who had tasted loss and exile, and who understood that thrones are not kept by right, but by the will and the sword. And in the April dawns to come, the will and the sword would be tested in blood. And so, as the exiled king reclaimed his throne and the storm clouds of war gathered over England, the first lightning strike would come at Barnet, where Edward and the Kingmaker would meet one last time. The Battle of Barnet, dawn on April 14, 1471, broke shrouded in a thick, ghostly mist over the fields north of Barnet. The fog rolled low across the hedgerows, swallowing banners and muffling the clink of armor. Two armies stood hidden from one another, so close that the neigh of a horse or the creak of a bowstring might carry across the void. Somewhere in that white silence lay the fate of England, and the reckoning between Edward IV and the man who had made him king. Edward's force numbered around 10,000, drawn up in 3 divisions. His own Yorkist standard, the sun in splendor, floated in the center, flanked by Gloucester's men on one side and Hastings on the other. Across the mist, Warwick commanded a slightly larger host under the Red Cross of St. George, reinforced by Oxford and Exeter. Both armies were tense, unseen but knowing the other was there, every soldier clutching his weapon like a talisman. The battle began not with a roar, but with the sudden whistle of arrows cutting through fog. War cries followed, disembodied and echoing in the mist. Edward spurred forward, a tall figure in gilded armor, his voice carrying over the din, urging his men to push through. The clash was blind and brutal. Formations stumbled into each other, sword met sword in sudden flashes, and men died without ever seeing the full shape of their enemy. On Warwick's left, Oxford's troops pressed hard against Hastings' flank, driving them back toward Barnet. But in the mist, victory turned to confusion. Oxford's men, their badges mistaken for the enemy's in the half-light, were attacked by their own side. Panic spread like fire in dry grass. Cries of "Treason!" shattered discipline, and Warwick's line began to buckle. Edward saw his moment. Rallying his center, he struck forward with the force of a hammer blow. The Kingmaker's men, already shaken, gave ground. The mist thickened, hiding the full extent of their collapse until it was too late. Warwick's army began to fragment, some units fleeing, others fighting on in small knots, surrounded and cut down. Warwick himself fought fiercely on foot, his horse sent away, a final act to show his men he would not abandon them. But even courage could not turn the tide. As the Yorkist advance swept through, the Kingmaker and his brother Montague were overwhelmed. Both fell, their bodies left among the tangle of broken pikes and bloodied surcoats. By late morning the fog began to lift. The field of Barnet lay revealed, strewn with the dead and dying, the banners of Lancaster and Warwick trampled into the churned mud. Edward's victory was complete, but it was not without cost. Hundreds of Yorkists lay among the fallen, their lives spent to secure a crown that had so often been bought in blood. The death of Warwick sent a shockwave through England. The man who had made and unmade kings was gone. His Game of Thrones ended not in triumph, but in the cold anonymity of a battlefield grave. For Edward, it was a personal and political reckoning. The shadow that had loomed over his reign was lifted, yet the war was far from over. Margaret of Anjou had landed in the west with her son, the Prince of Wales. Another confrontation loomed, one that would decide not just the crown, but the survival of the House of Lancaster itself. As Edward surveyed the field, the mist now burning away under a pale spring sun, he knew the Wars of the Roses had entered their final, most ruthless chapter. The Kingmaker was dead. But England's appetite for war was not yet sated. With Warwick fallen and the fog of Barnet still clinging to memory, Edward barely had time to breathe before the next storm gathered in the west. A storm bearing the banner of Lancaster and the unbroken will of Margaret of Anjou. The Battle of Tewkesbury. The road west was a race against fate. Barely weeks after Barnet, the Lancastrian cause, bloodied but unbroken, marched under Margaret of Anjou. Beside her rode Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, the last hope of the Red Rose. They had landed at Weymouth, intending to unite with Jasper Tudor's forces in Wales, but Edward IV, swift as a hunting hawk, had moved to intercept. By early May 1471, the chase ended near the quiet market town of Tewkesbury. The River Severn blocked Margaret's escape north. The Yorkist army barred the road. The field was a patchwork of meadows and hedgerows, with a gentle rise known as the Gaston. High ground Edward IV seized for his own. Beneath a bright, pitiless sun, banners cracked in the wind. the sun in splendor for York, the blood-red rose for Lancaster. Edward's army, hardened by years of civil war, stood in 3 divisions. Gloucester and Hastings anchored the flanks, while Edward himself commanded the center, towering in his gilded harness. Across the field, Somerset commanded the Lancastrian vanguard, with Prince Edward close behind under the watch of Lord Wenlock and the Duke of Exeter. Behind them, Queen Margaret watched from a distance, her fate bound to the clash about to begin. The opening came with a thunder of arrows. Yorkist archers advanced, loosing volleys into the Lancastrian line. Somerset, seeking to break the deadlock, led a daring flanking maneuver through wooded ground on Edward's right. For a moment, chaos favored the Red Rose. Yorkist troops reeled, their lines bending under the sudden assault. But Edward, ever quick to read the field, hurled reinforcements into the gap. The fighting became a maelstrom, men hacking at each other in the press, pikes splintering, the air thick with the screams of the wounded. Then came Somerset's fatal rage. Believing Lord Wenlock had failed to support his attack, he struck him down in full view of the army. That single act shattered Lancastrian cohesion. Discipline dissolved. The Yorkists surged forward. Edward pressed the advantage, driving the enemy back toward Tewkesbury's Abbey and the narrow lanes beyond. The retreat turned into a rout. Many Lancastrians fled into the Abbey, seeking sanctuary. Others were cut down in the fields or drowned in the millstream. On the Gaston slope, the Prince of Wales was captured. He would not live to see the sun set, struck down in the aftermath, ending the direct Lancastrian line in a moment that would be whispered about for generations. By evening, the Red Rose lay broken. The Yorkists roamed the field, gathering prisoners and ending pockets of resistance. Margaret of Anjou, the fierce wolf queen who had defied kings, was taken and brought before Edward IV. Her long war reduced to silence and guarded chains. Tewkesbury was not just a battle. It was the extinction of a dynasty's hope. The Lancastrian cause, once carried by the weight of kingship, now lay in graves scattered across a spring meadow. Edward IV, victorious yet unsmiling, knew that civil war had given him the throne again, but it had also bled England to the bone. In the Abbey, the chanting of monks rose over the sobs of the wounded, a fragile hymn to peace in a land that had almost forgotten the word. Outside, the banners of York snapped in the evening breeze, their bright colors stark against the fading light. The Wars of the Roses had not yet fully ended, but at Tewkesbury, one chapter closed forever. In steel, in blood, and in the silence that follows when the last cry of battle fades. But even as the sun set on Tewkesbury's blood-stained fields, Edward's work was not yet done, for the Red Rose still had thorns, and the final reckoning with Lancaster awaited at dawn. The end of the Lancastrians. The morning after Tewkesbury dawned clear and cold, the air sharp with the scent of trampled grass and blood. Mist clung low over the fields where the dead still lay. Men in harness sprawled among wildflowers, their faces turned toward a sky they would never again behold. The Yorkist banners fluttered above the town gates, the sun in splendor blazing in triumph, while the Red Rose lay trampled into the mud. In the Abbey, the echoes of battle had faded into whispers and prayers. Dozens of Lancastrian lords and knights huddled within, claiming sanctuary under holy law. They had fought for their king, for their queen, for the promise of a dynasty now reduced to ashes. Outside, Edward IV stood with his captains, his expression carved from stone. The law of God might shelter these men, but the law of kings was sharper and less forgiving. Orders were given. Armed men entered the Abbey. The clash of steel on flagstones shattered the stillness as sanctuary was broken. Somerset, Exeter's allies, and many of the Lancastrian leaders were dragged into the light. Some pleaded for mercy, others met their fate in silence. By Edward's command, executions followed swiftly, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold clarity of victory. In the shadow of these walls, the Prince of Wales, Henry VI's only son, lay dead. His bloodline was extinguished in a single blow, the thread of Lancastrian inheritance cut beyond repair. Margaret of Anjou, once the tireless heartbeat of resistance, was now a prisoner. She sat in a guarded chamber, her eyes hollow, the fire that had carried her through 2 decades of war smoldering low. The road from St. Albans to Tewkesbury had been long, and every mile had exacted its price. Edward IV rode to London soon after, bearing the fruits of his victory. Ahead of him lay the Tower, where another prisoner awaited. Henry VI, the man who had once worn the crown by divine right. For months Henry had languished in quiet captivity, a shadow of kingship. The chronicles would later record that on the night of May 21, 1471, he died in the Tower. Officially, it was said he passed away of melancholy upon hearing of his son's death. But in the guarded silence of the royal apartments, few doubted the truth. A dagger in the dark had ended his reign more decisively than any battle. With Henry dead, and his heir slain at Tewkesbury, the house of Lancaster was broken. The red rose had withered not in the blaze of a final charge, but in the slow, deliberate extinguishing of every claimant, every hope. Edward IV stood unchallenged, his throne no longer a contested prize, but a fortress of power reinforced by the ruthless certainty of dynastic survival. And yet, in the quiet corners of England, in manor houses and market stalls, the memory of Lancaster did not vanish. There were still those who whispered of wrongs unavenged, of justice denied. The Tudors, a distant branch through Owen Tudor's blood, still lived, and in them the ember of resistance flickered faintly, hidden but not extinguished. For now, though, the realm exhaled into uneasy peace. The Wars of the Roses had claimed tens of thousands, had seen kings deposed, restored, and slain. Fields once rich with harvest had been soaked in blood, and the nobility itself was thinned by the sword. Edward IV could now turn his gaze from the battlefield to the business of kingship, but the crown he wore was heavier for the price it had cost. At Tewkesbury Abbey the monks continued their prayers, their voices rising in Latin hymns for the souls of the fallen. The sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the stone floor in colors as vivid as the banners that had once flown above the field. Outside, the wind carried away the last smell of powder and blood, leaving only the silence of a kingdom at rest. For now. The House of York had triumphed. But history would remember that every victory carries the seed of its undoing. The Rose War was over, yet the soil in which it had grown was still fertile with ambition, vengeance, and the hunger for power. In that soil, the next storm waited, patient as time itself. Yet even in the glow of Yorkist triumph, time moved on, carrying England from the blood-soaked fields of Tewkesbury into a decade where Edward IV's rule would shine and quietly begin to crack. The final years of Edward IV. The banners of York still hung proudly over England, their white roses fresh in the public memory of Tewkesbury's triumph. A decade had passed since that spring of slaughter, and Edward IV now reigned over a kingdom that, at least on the surface, seemed healed. The fields that had once been churned into mud by cavalry were green again. The merchant ships of London and Bristol, once idle during the chaos of civil war, now plied the Channel and the North Sea with holds full of wool, tin, and wine. In the glow of victory, the court of Edward shone with a magnificence designed to impress both friend and foe. Inside Westminster, the great halls were lit with 1,000 candles, whose flames trembled in the gold leaf of painted ceilings. Minstrels played soft airs in the galleries, while noblemen, dressed in silks and fur, spoke in low voices of trade, diplomacy, and titles. Edward himself, tall and broad-shouldered even in middle age, still had the presence of a king carved from stone, though now that stone bore hairline cracks. The years of campaigning, the indulgence in rich banquets, and the ease of a throne won by blood had thickened his frame and slowed his stride. He was no longer the young warrior who had fought beneath the blinding banners at Towton. Now he was a monarch who had learned the subtler art of ruling, keeping enemies close, rewarding loyalty with calculated generosity, and ensuring that the crown's coffers never again stood empty. For much of the realm, these were years of relative peace, a rare gift in a generation accustomed to the roar of battle. Yet the peace was never absolute. Beneath the gilded trappings, the old fractures remained. The nobility had been thinned by the wars but not erased. The bloodlines of Lancaster were scattered but not extinguished, and among the surviving magnates of York there were rivalries as sharp as any blade. Edward's own policies planted seeds of discontent. His reliance on the Woodvilles, the ambitious family of his Queen Elizabeth, had drawn murmurs from the older, prouder houses. Men who had fought for York now found themselves edged out of favor by upstarts risen from the gentry. In council chambers, the smiles between factions were polite but cold. Each grant of land to a Woodville was another ember dropped into the hay of aristocratic pride, and Edward knew it. His court was a tapestry, rich and glittering, but woven of threads under constant strain. Beyond the court's intrigue, Edward faced the inescapable truth of time. By the late 1470s, illness began to dog him. A heaviness in the chest, bouts of fever, and a growing fatigue that no hunting trip or physician's tonic could banish. The king, once an athlete and a soldier, now often preferred the comfort of his chambers to the long councils of state. But when he did appear in public, at tournaments, on the feast days, in the streets of London, he still carried himself with the old grandeur, his deep voice steady, his command unquestioned. His mind, however, was increasingly fixed on the future, and on the fragility of succession. His heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, was only 12. The boy had his father's height and his mother's fine features, but his hands had never yet held a sword in earnest. The younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, was even more of a child. Edward IV understood better than anyone what such youth could mean in a kingdom where ambition was a predator that never slept. He began to arrange the Regency Council, intending to secure his son's inheritance. Yet every name on the list, Gloucester, Rivers, Hastings, was a man with his own ambitions, his own network of allies. Edward's great fear was not foreign invasion, but the inevitable human hunger for power that might erupt the moment his coffin lid closed. In March 1483, the shadows thickened. Edward fell gravely ill. Chroniclers wrote of a sudden decline, though others whispered that the years of rich living had simply caught up with him. He spoke with his confessor, settled matters of the realm as best he could, and in the presence of his courtiers gave his final instructions: loyalty to his sons, unity for the good of the crown. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died at the age of 40. His passing was marked by a funeral of unmatched spectacle. The roads into London thick with mourners, the abbey hung with black cloth, the tolling of bells carrying over the Thames like a dirge for an entire age. Cloaked in ermine and crowned with gold, his body was borne through the streets, past the watchful eyes of merchants, beggars, and soldiers alike. But behind the mourning lay calculation. In the hushed corridors of Westminster, eyes turned not toward the grave but toward the throne, and to the boy who would sit upon it. The peace Edward had held together through force of will was now a fragile vessel adrift on a sea already stirred by ambition. The decade of Yorkist stability had ended. The crown, still warm from Edward's brow, was about to become the most dangerous prize in England once more. But the peace Edward had built could not survive him, and with his death, the question of who would guard, or grasp, the crown passed swiftly into the hands of his brother, Richard of Gloucester. Richard III and the princes in the Tower. The death of Edward IV left a silence in England that was more dangerous than any roar of battle. His heir, Edward V, was a boy of 12, bright-eyed and well-schooled, but no match for the tides of ambition about to sweep the realm. Into this vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's youngest brother, a man whose loyalty during the Wars of the Roses had been legendary, whose sword had defended the Yorkist cause when others faltered. Richard's public image was that of a pious, dutiful uncle, a man uninterested in the glitter of court life. But beneath that careful exterior lay a calculating mind, sharpened by years of watching England's great families tear each other apart. He understood more than most that a crown worn by a child was a crown in peril, and that the guardians of such a crown often became its usurpers. When news of Edward IV's death reached him in the north, Richard moved quickly. With a small but loyal retinue, he rode south to meet his young nephew, who was traveling from Ludlow toward London. At Stony Stratford, Richard intercepted the royal party. The boy was greeted warmly, but key figures of the Woodville family, the Queen's powerful relatives, were arrested. To Richard's allies, it was a necessary safeguard against those who might control the young king for their own gain. To his enemies, it was the first shadow cast over the prince's reign. London received the pair with cautious ceremony. Edward V was lodged in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, not yet the sinister prison of later imagination, but the traditional residence for a monarch awaiting coronation. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, joined him there soon after. Then the days began to stretch. The coronation, scheduled for early May, was delayed. Rumors spread through the city's taverns and marketplaces, whispers that the princes would never wear their father's crown. Richard, meanwhile, summoned lords and clergy, presenting a case that shocked even seasoned courtiers. Edward IV, he claimed, had been secretly betrothed before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, making all their children illegitimate. By this reasoning, Edward V had no right to the throne. The argument, supported by select clergy and allies, gained just enough traction. In late June 1483, Parliament ratified Richard's claim. On July 6th, he was crowned Richard III, anointed beneath the high vaults of Westminster Abbey, while the princes remained unseen within the Tower. Here, the narrative darkens, not because the records are clear, but because they are not. Chroniclers, foreign ambassadors, and later Tudor propagandists all embroidered their accounts. But the fact remains. By the end of the summer, the boys vanished from public view. No proclamations announced their deaths, no bodies were displayed, yet their absence became a living rumor that stalked Richard's reign. Some said they were quietly murdered, smothered as they slept, the work of agents loyal to the new king. Others argued they lingered for months before disease or neglect claimed them. A few insisted they had been spirited away in secret. But in the eyes of much of England, and in the foreign courts of Europe, Richard was branded with the suspicion of fratricide, a stain no crown could polish away. The imagery of the two lost princes became a potent weapon. Balladeers in London sang melancholy verses of the rightful heirs imprisoned by a false king. Preachers hinted at divine judgment for such a crime, though no one dared speak too plainly. The Tower itself, with its cold stone walls and ravens circling above, took on a new symbolism. Not as a fortress of the realm, but as the silent witness to an unspoken atrocity. Richard pressed on with his rule, displaying energy and competence in matters of law and defense. Yet every act of governance was haunted by the specter of the Tower. Foreign alliances were harder to secure. Rebellions flared in the west, encouraged by Lancastrian exiles who now had a rallying cry, the blood of innocents. The very stability Richard sought to impose through decisive action was undermined by the lingering question, what happened to Edward and his brother? By the end of 1483, the realm had begun to fracture again. In the south, in the north, across the sea in Brittany, discontented nobles and exiled claimants sharpened their knives, all waiting for the moment when the shadow over Richard's throne would become his undoing. The crown was his, but the ghost of the princes walked beside him, unseen, unheard, yet more dangerous than any living foe. Yet even as Richard wore the crown, its weight was already shifting, for across the Channel another claimant was quietly shaping the storm that would one day break over his throne, Henry Tudor's return. Across the Channel, far from the cold stone shadows of the Tower, a different figure was watching England's turmoil with quiet calculation. Henry Tudor, a man with a fragile claim to the throne, yet a name that carried the last embers of Lancastrian blood, had spent most of his life in exile. To the casual observer, he was a political relic, a survivor of a cause long thought extinguished after the Yorkist triumphs. But history, as so often before, was ready to twist unexpectedly. Henry's claim to the English crown was tenuous. Through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, descended from John of Gaunt, but tainted by a line once barred from succession. Yet in the eyes of discontented nobles and the scattered remnants of the Lancastrian faction, he was the only viable banner under which to rally. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower had altered the game entirely, not only stripping the Yorkists of their innocent figureheads, but also giving Henry a weapon far sharper than any sword: moral outrage. From his base in Brittany, Henry moved like a man who knew his moment had arrived. Couriers slipped across the Channel, carrying letters inked in cautious but determined hands, each one a whisper of conspiracy to England's great houses. He pledged not only to take the throne from Richard III, but to unite the warring roses of York and Lancaster by marrying Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. It was a promise of reconciliation, a vision of a realm where red and white would be woven into one crown. Support began to coalesce in unexpected places. Some Yorkist loyalists, disillusioned by Richard's suspected crimes, began to imagine a future where Henry was not an enemy, but a savior. Margaret Beaufort, tireless and shrewd, worked the political threads from within England, her influence reaching into households that had once fought fiercely against her cause. Across the sea, Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle and constant guardian, handled the logistics of men, ships, and coin. By early summer of 1485, preparations for the final gamble were underway. In the shipyards of Brittany, carpenters and sailors worked under tight secrecy, outfitting a modest fleet. The smell of pitch and salt clung to the air as hulls were caulked, masts stepped, and barrels of provisions rolled aboard. Men were hired quietly, seasoned archers from Wales, soldiers hardened in France's endless wars, mercenaries whose loyalty could be bought but whose steel was reliable. Henry himself moved among them with a quiet intensity, his lean frame belying the resolve in his gaze. He was no warrior king in the mold of Edward IV, no towering presence on the battlefield, but his greatest weapon was patience, and the ability to let his enemies make their own mistakes. In him, there was a sense of inevitability, as if exile had been less a punishment than a long, deliberate sharpening of the blade. In England, Richard III was not blind to these movements. Spies reported the mustering in Brittany, the gathering of discontented lords, the whispers of foreign backing. He ordered defenses readied, loyal nobles summoned, and coastal watches strengthened. But his throne was no longer secure stone. It was ice, and each day the thaw crept closer. When Henry's fleet finally set sail in August, the Channel was restless beneath a gray sky. Gulls wheeled above the white wake as the ships cut toward the Welsh coast. It was not the armada of a conqueror, barely a few thousand men in all, but history had shown that in England, a small force with the right allies could topple a king. They landed at Milford Haven, Wales, greeted not with resistance, but with quiet, growing support. The Welsh hills, green and wind-scoured, had always been friendly to the Tudor name. From there, Henry's army began its march eastward, gathering strength with each mile. The long, narrow columns wound through valleys and over ridges, their banners snapping in the late summer wind, the red dragon of Cadwallader flying beside the standard of St. George. The march was more than a military maneuver. It was a living declaration that the game had changed. Every village passed, Every lord who joined was a stone added to the weight that would soon crash upon Bosworth Field. Henry knew the gamble he played. Should he lose, his life would end on English soil as a traitor's, his name carved into the same dark ledger as all failed claimants. But the risk was matched by the prize, the crown itself, and the chance to close the wound that had bled England for decades. As summer ripened toward its end, the armies of Richard and Henry moved inexorably toward each other. The stage was set, the actors in place. The Red Dragon and the White Boar would soon meet, and one would vanish from England's banners forever. And so, as Henry's army pressed eastward and Richard braced for the blow, the long road of intrigue, exile, and suspicion narrowed to a single field where England's fate would be decided. Bosworth and the end of the Plantagenets. Dawn broke over Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, casting a pale gold light over the rolling Leicestershire countryside. The ground was damp with dew, the air sharp with the scent of trampled grass and the metallic tang of anticipation. Two armies faced each other across the undulating land, one wearing the badge of the White Boar, the other the Red Dragon. Between them lay not only the fate of a crown, but the closing chapter of a dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. Richard III's host stood larger in number, seasoned in war, their armor catching the new sun like a scatter of mirrors. Standards snapped in the breeze. The White Boar of the King, the banners of Norfolk, Surrey, and Northumberland. On the far side, Henry Tudor's force was smaller, leaner, a mix of Welsh spearmen, French mercenaries, and English exiles. Yet their march had been a chain of gathering promises, and behind every soldier was the belief that the hour of change had arrived. The terrain itself was a silent participant in the day's drama. Marshy ground hemmed the field, forcing movement into narrow channels where cavalry charges could falter and men could die in the sucking mud. At the flanks, low rises offered advantage to archers and commanders with the wit to seize them. In the distance, watching from a neutral position, stood the army of Thomas, Lord Stanley, a man whose loyalties were as unreadable as the morning mist. The first clash was sudden, a crack of steel on steel as Richard's vanguard pressed forward, their boots churning the sodden earth. Arrows hissed through the air in dark, whistling arcs, some finding shields, others striking unarmored flesh with a thud. Henry's men bent into the impact, the Red Dragon fluttering defiantly above the press of bodies. French pike formations locked against the English advance, their shafts braced, holding the line like a wall of thorns. From his vantage, Richard scanned the battlefield with the keen eye of a soldier king. He saw an opening. Henry's personal guard, lighter in number, moving across open ground toward the Stanleys. If the boy from Brittany could be struck down before their eyes, the rebellion would die with him. Spurring his horse, Richard led a sudden, thunderous charge, his knights surging forward in a gleam of steel and pennons. It was the kind of move that had made his reputation, bold, decisive, almost reckless. Cutting through the melee, Richard's lance shattered against a guard's breastplate. He drew his sword and pressed on, slashing, driving toward the banner of the Red Dragon. The clash became a knot of fury. Shouts, grunts, the clang of steel, the scream of wounded horses. Henry's standard-bearer fell, the banner dipping toward the mud before another hand caught it aloft. Then the tide shifted. The Stanleys, their moment of choice upon them, spurred into the fray, not to Richard's aid, but against him. Their cavalry swept into his flank, trapping the king's small retinue. What had been an audacious gamble became a tightening noose. Richard fought with the desperation of a man who knew there would be no retreat, cutting down foes, his armor dented and slick. Chroniclers would later claim he refused to flee, crying that he would die a king of England. The final moments were brutal and swift. Surrounded, dragged from his horse, Richard fell beneath a flurry of blows. When the dust settled, his crown, a simple circlet worn over his helmet, was plucked from the mud and carried to Henry Tudor. There, on the edge of Bosworth Field, before the blood had dried, Henry was hailed as King Henry VII. The white boar lay trampled in the grass. The Plantagenet line ended not in ceremony, but in the churned earth of battle. The victory was not only military, it was symbolic, a closing of the book on decades of fratricidal war. Yet even as the banners of Lancaster and York were imagined in union, the air still smelled of iron and loss. Bosworth was more than a battle. It was the hinge on which English history turned. From the chaos of ambition and betrayal emerged a new dynasty, one that would weld the fractured realm under a single rose, red over white. But in the mud and mist of that morning, it was simply the moment when one man's gamble met another's resolve, and the crown passed from one set of blood-stained hands to another. And so, with the red dragon triumphant and the white boar trampled into the mud, the smoke of Bosworth gave way to the dawn of a new reign, one that would try to bind England's wounds as tightly as its crown. Legacy and conclusion. The dust of Bosworth had barely settled when the weight of history began to shift. Henry Tudor's coronation in Westminster Abbey that October was more than ceremony. It was an act of alchemy, attempting to transmute decades of civil bloodshed into the promise of unity. The banners of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were woven into one emblem, the Tudor rose, a symbol meant to erase the memory of brother fighting brother. Yet symbols, however potent, could not instantly wash away the scars carved into England's soul. The War of the Roses had begun as a feud between noble houses, but it had ended as a reshaping of the monarchy itself. The old Plantagenet order, with its fractious magnates and dangerous overmighty subjects, was broken. In its place rose a crown more centralized, more guarded and more determined never again to be hostage to the ambitions of the great lords. Henry VII, cautious and calculating, would keep the nobility on a short leash, using marriage alliances, financial bonds, and the steady grind of administration to secure his throne. Yet even as stability returned, the ghosts of the war lingered. Families had been split, estates ruined, and loyalties twisted into knots that would take generations to untangle. The countryside still bore the silent testimony of abandoned manors and fields left fallow during the years of campaigning. For those who had survived, the peace felt fragile, as if any careless spark could reignite the old flames. In the long arc of English history, the Wars of the Roses stood as both a warning and a crucible. It had been a war without clear victors for much of its course, a shifting game of thrones in which kings were made and unmade on muddy fields like St. Albans, Towton, and Tewkesbury. The reign of Henry VI had revealed the peril of a crown worn by a man unfit for its weight. Margaret of Anjou had shown the ferocity with which a queen could fight for her child's inheritance. The rise and fall of Edward IV had proven how charisma could win kingdoms, yet not guarantee peace. Richard III's fate at Bosworth had underscored that even the boldest soldier could not outrun the tide of betrayal. And through it all, the common people had carried the heaviest burden. While kings and nobles traded blows for the throne, it was the farmers, artisans, and townsfolk who paid in coin, labor, and blood. Armies lived off their land, sieges crushed their livelihoods, and shifting allegiances forced them into a constant, dangerous dance of survival. To them, the Tudor rose was not only a heraldic device. It was a fragile hope that their children might live in a time when the clash of steel was no longer the soundtrack of the realm. From a historian's vantage, the end of the Wars of the Roses was not merely the closing of a chapter, but the opening of another, one that would see the Tudors transform England into a more unified and powerful state. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York was the linchpin of this transformation, turning a political settlement into a dynastic reality. Their son, Henry VIII, and granddaughter Elizabeth I would carry the Tudor legacy into an era of Renaissance splendor, religious upheaval, and imperial ambition. Yet the lessons of the Roses remained etched beneath the grandeur. The war had taught England that succession crises could unravel a kingdom, that unchecked ambition could drain it of lifeblood, and that peace, once shattered, took decades to mend. These truths lingered in the cautious policies of Henry VII, in the wary eyes of his court, and in the guarded walls of his realm. Cinematically, the story of the Wars of the Roses closes not on the field of Bosworth, but in the quiet aftermath. In the way the crown sat heavily on Henry's head as he walked through the echoing aisles of Westminster. In the way the people cheered, yet glanced over their shoulders as if expecting another army to appear on the horizon. It closes in the knowledge that history is never truly finished. It only turns its face toward a new chapter. For England, that chapter was the Tudor Age, a time when the monarchy would rise to heights of power unimaginable in the war-torn years of the 15th century. But the Roses, red and white, would always remain, pressed together in heraldry, their thorns buried deep in the memory of a nation that had learned the hard price of unity.